Hey, so I, 24F, recently came into a lot of money after my grandma passed away, and that's become the bone of contention between me and my estranged father, 48M. My parents got married a month after I was conceived after dating for 2 years. I was the real reason they got married, and initially, everything was nice and happy. But then my mother was diagnosed with stage 3 throat cancer, and before I was old enough to even process it, she was gone. She passed away when I was really little, around 5 or 6 years old, after battling cancer for a really long time. After that, it was an uphill climb for all of us emotionally, because it was really difficult to process a loss like that since my mother was very young and so was I. My mother's parents lived in Missouri and would often come to visit me here in San Francisco, but they couldn't take care of me full time. So I lived with my dad and my grandma, my dad's mom. Things were tough because my dad was also kind of young and he had a family to support now. For the first 10 years, it was easier since my grandpa was around to take care of the family business. It wasn't a very large scale or successful business, but it was something nevertheless, and it could put food on the table, so at the time, that was enough. My grandpa would run the family business and my dad was trying to make his way up the corporate ladder. Then when I was 15, my grandpa passed away from a heart attack and our family fell apart. My grandpa had left the business to my dad and my grandma to run, but he didn't want it, and so the responsibility fell entirely to my grandma, who literally had no idea how to run a business. She'd never been to college and had married her husband young, and after that, she'd just been a som. She considered selling the business but couldn't bring herself to do it because she knew how much it meant to her husband. She couldn't sell it because of her sentimental attachment to it, and that led to a lot of problems between her and my dad, who wanted to sell it and move into a bigger apartment and a more upmarket address so he'd be able to impress his business associates with it. After a lot of fighting, my grandma told him that he could ditch the business if he wanted to, but she wasn't going to sell. Somehow, we managed to rope in my maternal grandparents to buy out my dad's share so he could be rid of it all, but we'd still keep the business within the family, and they agreed to it because they'd always been on good terms with my grandma. But that wasn't an end to all of our problems like we'd expected it to be, and in fact, it was just the beginning. Like I said, my grandma had no idea how to run a business, and so it was really difficult for her to keep it up and running. She was thankful that some of my grandpa's employees had still stuck around and were trying to help her when a lot of them quit after my grandpa died. Honestly, can't blame them either, because in the first couple of years, my grandma wasn't very good and things were going really badly for us. I was just 15, so obviously I was of no help. My dad used to live with us, but he was of no help to us whatsoever. Every time my grandma would try to ask him for advice or help, he would shut it down and get mad because he didn't want to hear about it, and his only solution to any business-related problems was to just sell it off and let it go. But at that point, we couldn't even do that because the business was doing so badly. It wasn't profitable enough for someone to even buy us out, and we were a local, small-scale business, so it was getting harder and harder for us to keep up. My dad was of no help and the employees were quitting left and right, but in spite of all of that, my maternal grandparents tried to be supportive and even offered to involve more people to fund the business, but my grandma refused because she couldn't put more money at risk back then. Things got even worse when, after a year, my dad met a woman at work and moved in with her, so now my grandma and I were completely on our own because he wouldn't even come back home to us. He would send us some money occasionally, but we were literally living hand to mouth by then. He didn't take me with him to live with his new girlfriend because she wasn't comfortable with the idea of having to live with his ex-wife's teen daughter. My dad would come by once a week for dinner with the family, but even then, he wasn't all there with us and would either be on the phone or just silently eat his dinner and then leave. It was clear to me then that he was just doing it as an obligation, but he didn't want to spend any time with me or his mother at all. At 15, I finally gave up any hopes of my father ever stepping up and being a good dad to me. Until then, I'd still hoped and prayed that someday we might have a good relationship, but after he moved in with his girlfriend, I gave up because that was never going to happen. Then a couple of weeks before my 18th birthday, he proved me right by cutting ties with us entirely. He eloped with his second wife and didn't even bother to tell us in person. He sent us an email to inform us that he was moving to NYC with his wife and said that he didn't want us contacting him anymore. I was not going to be a minor anymore in just a few weeks, so he had no legal obligations tying him down anymore. I wasn't surprised in the slightest, but my grandma was disappointed, so I had to be strong through it all for the both of us. He'd blocked me and my grandma so we couldn't contact him, and I think he'd even changed his number. I was mostly worried about how I was going to pay for college because I really couldn't afford a student loan given how ridiculously difficult they are to pay off in the future. I already knew I wanted a business degree and my grades were decent too, so I was desperate to go to college and learn things that would help me and my grandma in the real world. I'd already been doing a lot of research and homework on how to restart the business, which had been nothing but a huge liability so far, and we'd made it even worse somehow. Financially, we were doing pretty badly, and now it was about to get worse because my dad had left. We could have asked for help from my maternal grandparents, but they'd already helped us out with the business and we couldn't just keep on asking them for more. Both of them were retired teachers and it wasn't like they had a fortune to spend either. I just couldn't sit by and let that happen, so as a last resort, I decided to take matters into my own hands instead of waiting for someone to come along and fix things for me. I was supposed to start college in the fall, but a couple of months before that, around the same time as my birthday, I decided that I was going to go online and try to promote our family business. I can't say exactly what we deal in because that might make us easier to track, but it's something that appeals to women mostly. We did have a business page, but it was useless and mostly inactive because with school and household chores that my grandma couldn't do due to her age, I didn't have the time to look after that as well, and my grandma wasn't very good with social media. So it was just there, it existed, but it was of no use to us. Around 2017-18, the whole promotion of small, local businesses on social media was sort of working, and once I graduated from high school, I decided to put all my time and energy into that before college. So while my friends were out celebrating this new chapter of our lives, I was back home applying to colleges that I could afford to attend even by a long shot, and working on rebooting the page. Luckily, around a few weeks in, one of our posts about a certain product went viral, and soon enough our inbox was flooded with people from all over the state wanting to buy from us. Not just that one product, but also others that we sold, and we grew exponentially in the coming few months. We were able to pay off all our debts over time and even started saving, thanks to the sheer power of social media. It's been 6 years and we're still going pretty strong. I wouldn't say that we're millionaires, but our business was doing well enough for me to be able to attend college without loans or anything. After I graduated, I came back and took over running it all so that my grandma could retire, and that's how it's been for the last couple of years. Now earlier this year, my grandma passed away and I was shattered over it because she was my whole world, but I was happy that she'd passed in her sleep. She was in her late 70s and had lived a long and eventful life. She died of natural causes and passed away peacefully and painlessly. That's more than enough for me. I didn't tell my dad or call him to the funeral because I didn't know how to reach him. I could have of course done some digging to find out, but I didn't want to do that because it didn't seem worth it. Also, if I hadn't done that when he'd abandoned us, then I didn't see any reason for me to do it now. It's been several months since my grandma passed, and recently, I was informed of her will. She left her shares of the business to me while the remaining 50% was still owned by my maternal grandparents, but I know that they're going to leave their shares to me as well, so I really own this business now. What came as a surprise to me was that she'd also left the house and all her savings to me as well. And she'd managed to save a lot over the past 6 years because she'd lived the same frugal and modest lifestyle that she'd always been used to. So I basically inherited everything, but my father also inherited something that I found out about only recently. He'd inherited this really old and weird abstract painting that my grandma kept in the living room, even though it was very ugly and didn't go with the room's aesthetic at all. Apparently, that was something that my dad had insisted that she buy at an art exhibit when he was 10 years old, and she'd kept it all these years as a memory. All of this happened a couple of weeks ago because my grandmother had left strict instructions that the contents of the will were not to be disclosed until the probate process was done. My grandma's lawyer had notified both me and my dad when the process began, and it had been shortly after the funeral. He was very upset that I hadn't contacted him first, but even the lawyer had to hire a professional to locate him, so it was ridiculous for him to even expect that I'd go to such lengths for a person who hadn't checked on us even once in the last 6 years. We didn't speak after that for months until recently, when the reading of the will took place, and it was a virtual meeting since we were in different states and he was too busy to fly down here. There, I was told about what I'd be getting out of this, and my dad only had one dusty old painting, so there wasn't much to say there. She'd also left my maternal grandparents a little money and some of her jewelry as a thank you for everything they'd done, so they were part of the meeting as well. We were all present to witness the spectacular meltdown that my dad had once he realized that he was only getting one painting that wasn't even worth much. He yelled at me and accused me of stealing his life from him, said that I was a crook and whatnot. It got to a point where he had to be removed from the video conference by the lawyer so we could end it. He'd have to be there to sign a couple of documents in a few weeks anyway, so I knew that this wasn't over as long as he didn't get what he wanted, but I didn't care. I knew that I deserved all of this and that I'd worked hard for it. It hadn't just all been handed to me, but I'd earned it. Throughout college, I would make sure to teach my grandma all she needed to know, and sometimes we'd even end up on calls at odd hours so that she could consult with me before making any financial decisions. So I was not only keeping my grades up, but I was also working on keeping the business up and running. I was also running the social media page along with a couple of interns I'd hired, so I'd been working for the business right from my college days. I'd earned every bit of this, and yet that didn't seem to be good enough for him. I wasn't worried at the time, but 3 days back, my dad came by to visit me, and it was a very emotionally charged reunion for us. He'd come back for the signing of certain documents that we were already done with, so we didn't need to be there. He told me that he'd come to visit me right after meeting with the lawyer, and even though my grandma's attorney refused to tell him about my inheritance, he'd figured out that I'd inherited the business and the house. While he was at the door, he told me that he just wanted to talk and clear the air because it had been a long time since he left. He didn't want our relationship to get worse and worse with time, so I decided to have a discussion with him once and for all so we could clear the air or whatever. Most of whatever he said just sounded like excuses, and I wasn't too touched by it. He was in a bad space and was still struggling to do well at work. He wanted a fresh start without any reminders of his past. He was really stressed out and stuff, blah blah blah. It wasn't the struggle story he thought it was, and it definitely didn't excuse him for whatever he'd done. I was just waiting for him to get that story over with when he told me that now that he was back, he wanted to join me and come on board as an investor or maybe even a co-owner. I said no without even thinking about it because there was just no way that it was happening. Not after he literally abandoned me and my grandma and didn't even bother to contact us ever after that. He'd let me and my grandma down on multiple occasions and had never once stepped up to be the father that I deserved or the son that she deserved, so now, he didn't just get to hop on the bandwagon and piggyback on what was supposed to be my success. I told him that I wasn't okay with that, and if that's really what he was here for, then he could just leave because it was never going to happen. He could save his breath instead of trying to convince me, but he went on to get annoyed and tried to make it seem like that's not all he was here for. He even said that he genuinely wanted to reconcile with me and rebuild our relationship, but he'd blown his cover already, so I wasn't going to fall for any more of what he was saying. I didn't even want to hear him out, but he went on and on about how I was overreacting and he just wanted to help. At one point, I told him that if he didn't leave then I would call the police, and he flared up at that. He called me ungrateful, and of course, he played the mom card and told me that my mother would have hated this. I didn't even care and told him that if my mom was around then maybe he would have still stuck around, but unfortunately, I kind of grew up without either parent, and it was mostly my grandparents who raised me. So if I owe anyone anything, it was them and not him. He always just did the bare minimum for us and thought that it was alright, so now he could expect the bare minimum in return too. That seemed to shut him up for a while, but I could see that he was getting all teary-eyed, and that made me really uncomfortable because my dad hardly cries. I've literally never seen my dad cry ever, not even when his dad passed away and they were pretty close. So his crying was a huge deal because he was mostly a stoic guy. I took a step back at that moment and he told me that I had no right to that business because at the end of the day, it was his father who had built it for him and now I'd just swooped in and stolen it all away from him. Then he walked out and I could actually hear him crying as he walked away. It's been 3 days and I can't help but think that maybe what he said was true. This business had been intended by my grandfather to be taken over by my father eventually, but he'd rejected it and so this came to me. The least I can do is make him a partner in the business, but if there's no trust then there's no point. I don't understand what to do. Ida for refusing to let my dad join me in the business. My grandfather left us after he abandoned me and my grandmother for 6 years. Update 1. Hello. So I've decided to stick to my previous decision of not letting my father join me in the business. He rejected it first when it had been offered to him and then went MIA for 6 years, which is when my grandma and I handled it all. He doesn't deserve this and I know that now. Besides, I also found out that he has literally no credibility in the market at this point. I had people do some digging on him and we found out that he's most definitely living off of his wife's money at the moment because both the businesses he'd been involved in the past had failed. One of them had been a seafood restaurant chain that lasted for a couple of years but then eventually had to be shut down after facing a lot of losses, and then, 2 years ago, he tried to get into the food industry again with another product idea which also didn't work and shut down relatively faster. His wife's some biggie in the corporate world and is the CFO of her dad's company, which finally helped me make sense of why my dad was so willing to dance to her tunes back when they were dating. I'm sure that even if he wanted to invest or buy out part of our business, he'd do it with her money because I highly doubt he has any of his own at this point. After 2 failed businesses in 6 years, it seems unlikely, and I'm sure that joining me was his last attempt at making something of his own so he could stop living off of his wife's wealth. Too bad it's not happening because we're doing just fine without him and his money. And more importantly, if I can't trust him on a personal level, then I don't think I'd be willing to involve a person like that in my business that my grandma and I have worked so incredibly hard to revive. I'm glad that I posted about it here because a couple of the comments were really brutal with the reality check. I was allowing him to gaslight me into believing that he had any right over the business now after he'd sold his shares so long ago. All that emotional manipulation almost got to me, but I'm lucky I didn't break. So anyway, that's not happening anymore and I hope he doesn't come back to try and change my mind either. Update 2. Hey, everyone. My dad flew back to NYC last Monday and today's Wednesday, so a significant amount of time has passed since he left, but unfortunately he's still holding out hope that maybe I'll let him become a partner or something. He texted me from a number I didn't have saved so he could talk to me without getting blocked. Yet again, he asked me if I'd reconsidered my stance on his proposal, and when I said no, he replied by saying that I was being unreasonable and that this would only help my business grow exponentially. I don't think that's true in the first place, and even if it was, I still wouldn't let him come on board. I have zero trust in him and I don't respect him as a person. I texted him these exact things to let him know just how much I didn't want him as a business partner. I also told him that I was aware of his failed businesses in the past and that he depended on his wife to fund him. So technically, it wasn't even his money that I was refusing, it was his wife's. The bottom line was that no matter how much he offered, he was not going to be made a partner in the business and neither could he join as an investor. He had put in no time or hard work, so the entitlement to expect this from me was ridiculous. I blocked him after saying that and he hasn't been able to contact me since, although I did notice that he was typing something when I blocked him. I really don't want to find out what it was that he was saying because I have A. no interest and B. no time to talk to him. I'm done with this situation and I just wish he'd let it go too. Update 3. So I'm not entirely sure, but I think the drama regarding my dad and the business is over now. I didn't do anything though, it was all him. He made the mistake of spamming my comments with thief, crook and tons of bad reviews. None of which were true, of course. My business depends heavily on word of mouth, so this was really bad for me. And my dad was well aware of it, which is why he did this. It just proved what a huge gold digger and selfish jerk he was, because if he had any respect for his father at all, he wouldn't have tried to sabotage me and the business he built from the ground up. So I filed a case against him for trying to defame me, and that was enough for him to back off, probably because his wife wasn't going to tolerate it and they had a lot to lose if I chose to go public with that information. I've also filed a petition for a protective order against him. I don't know what's going to happen with it though, but he had been harassing me online and I'm sure it would have gone on for a long time if I hadn't initiated legal action against him. Anyway, this is where it ends hopefully. I'm doing great, and even though I do miss my grandma sometimes, I know she'd be proud of me and how far I've come. How far both of us have come, actually. Thank you for being there for me throughout this, because even though you guys don't realize it, Reddit has sort of become a safe space for me during these past few days. Venting to you guys helped me keep my head straight and I couldn't be more thankful for it.